Hello, welcome to Off the Shelf. Tonight, I'm reading Chapter 6 of Resident Evil Zero Hour. Enjoy. Billy woke up to pain and the smell of burning synthetics. He opened his eyes, blinking, assessing his surroundings as quickly as his muddled mind could manage. Which wasn't very quickly at all. He was on his back, looking up at a high, blank ceiling. Firelight flickered all around him. Shadows of rubble and rock dancing across part of a wall to his left. Somehow, he was inside. The brakes. The train. Rebecca? That woke him up. He pushed himself to a sitting position, was surprised and relieved to realize he had a strained shoulder and a few scrapes, but nothing worse. Rebecca, he called and coughed. Wherever he was, the billowing smoke from the wreck was starting to build up. They had to move. He stood cradling his right arm. As he looked around, the train crashed into a warehouse. It looked like a giant empty space, concrete, a scaffolding off to one side, a few hooded lights overhead. It wasn't very well lit, but when he looked down, he saw a dented train track beneath his feet, and realized that they had probably crashed into the train's maintenance terminal, wherever that is. Rebecca, he called again, surveying the wreckage. There were numerous piles of blasted concrete and puddles of burning oil all around. The engine was on its side. The other cars were piled up behind it, blocking what had to be a monster hole in the wall. He had no idea where to look for the young STARS member. As soon as he'd activated the rear brakes, he started running back toward the front. He must have been thrown up from the back passenger car. A slumped shadow stirred near a pile of smoking rock. Rebecca! He stumbled forward, hoping she was all right. She had sounded panicked when she called. When he hadn't answered, but he'd been too busy punching buttons to talk. Now he was sorry. She was just a kid after all, and had been scared shitless. I should have reassured her. Something. He reached the crumpled, battered body and started to kneel beside her. She was face down, her clothes shredded. Billy? Billy turned, saw Rebecca walking toward him, her 9mm in hand. She had a trickle of blood seeping from her hairline, but appeared to be in good shape otherwise. And the person in front of him rolled over, moaning again, reaching one bloody hand up to grasp his face. Rotting fingers trailed across his cheek. Gah! With a wordless cry of disgust, he reeled back, fell on the floor. He couldn't tell if the slow-moving creature was male or female. So much to its face and body had been damaged, either by the disease or from the crash. It crawled to its knees, turning its disfigured face toward Billy. Its mouth open, and blood-tinted drool poured from between its broken teeth as it reached for him again. Get clear, Rebecca said, and he was only too glad to comply, scrabbling backward on his hands, the loose handcuff digging painfully into the flesh of his left palm. Pushing with his feet, she aimed and fired twice, both rounds finding the once human's already fractured skull, ending what was left of its life. It settled to the concrete with a sound almost like a sigh. Billy stood up, and they both spent a few tense seconds scanning the wreckage for any other bodies. If there were more, they were hidden. Thanks, he said, looking back at the pathetic creature. She'd spared it further suffering, at least. And with 2 clean headshots, he was surprised and not a little impressed at her level of skill. Are you okay? Yes, I've got a killer headache. But that's all. My second crash of the day, too. Really? Billy asked. What was the first? She smiled, started to speak, then abruptly stopped, her expression turning cool, and Billy felt a pang of real unhappiness. She obviously remembered who she was talking to in spite of everything. She still thought he was a mass murderer. It's not important, she said. Come on. We should get out of here before the smoke gets any worse. They both still had their radios, spent a moment looking for his gun, finding it half hidden by a crushed concrete block not far from where he'd woken up. The shotgun was history. Neither of them suggested searching the train for it. The small fires were dying out, but the thick layer of black smoke that hovered at the ceiling was growing by the minute. They moved around the vast room, finding only single door some 20 meters from the wrecked engine and very little else. Billy hoped it led to fresh air, to freedom for himself, and safety for the girl. Standing at the door, he looked back at the smoldering crash, felt one corner of his mouth curve up. Well, at least we managed to stop the train, he said. Rebecca nodded. Her smile was weak, but game. We managed, she replied. They turned back to the door, taking a deep breath. Billy reached out and turned the handle, pushing it open. It was surreal, watching the train crash into the basement of the training facility on screen, hearing the dull thunder of a crash a beat later. They felt it too, a very faint rumble in the walls all around them. In seconds, the camera lens was obscured by smoke. We should get out of here now, Birkin said, pacing behind Wesker's chair. He wasn't worried about fire. The old terminal was practically made out of cement. But a train crash was hard to miss, and not every cop and fireman in the vicinity was on Umbrella's payroll. The facility was isolated, but it would only take a phone call from one concerned citizen and Umbrella's bioweapons work would be exposed. Wesker didn't seem to be listening. He tapped at the monitor controls, shifting camera perspectives through other parts of the facility, searching for something. He barely said a word since the final transmission from the cleanup crew. Are you listening to me? Birkin asked, not for the first time in the past few minutes. He was tense, and Wesker's cavalier attitude wasn't helping. I hear you, William, Wesker said, still watching the screens. If you want to leave, leave. Well, aren't you coming? Oh, in a while, he answered, his tone calmly. I just want to check on a few things. Like what? I'd say the train is pretty much cleaned up. That's why we came, isn't it? Wesker didn't answer, only keeping the screens. Birkin's hands clenched into fists. God, the man could be insufferable. That was the problem with sociopaths. The inability to empathize tended to make them completely self-centered. I've got work to do, Birkin thought, looking toward the door. Work, a family. He wasn't going to wait around for Joe Firefighter to come knocking, looking for an explanation as to why there were zombies wandering around the crash site. Ah, there we are, Wesker said, thumbing a key beneath one of the screens. It was the main lobby of the facility, built to welcome execs and grunts alike into the less than legal world of White Umbrella. And as they watched, a hand came up through the floor, pushing aside a square over. That's the old access tunnel. Leads from the terminal, Birkin leaned forward, curious in spite of himself. A man with an elaborate tattoo on one arm crawled out of the dark square in the northwest corner of the room, followed by a small woman in a STARS uniform. A girl, really. Both carried handguns and looked around the finely decorated lobby with expressions. Birkin couldn't read from the small screen. Who on earth are those people? The girl is the STARS rookie, B team, Wesker said. No one of consequence. The male I don't recognize. Do you think they were on the train? Had to have been, Wesker said. Birkin felt a new surge of panic. What are we going to do? Wesker glanced at him, one eyebrow arched. What do you mean? She's with STARS, and who knows who he's working for. What if they escape? Don't be obtuse, William. They won't escape. Even if the facility wasn't locked down, the place is overrun with carriers. All they have to do is open a door or two, and they'll cease to be of any concern. Wesker's bland tone was chilling, but he had a point. The chances of anyone getting out of the facility were slim to none, as he watched the two intruders move carefully around the big room. Only one of the rooms in the building free of the infected, both sweeping their weapons side to side. After a thorough check, the girl walked up the grand staircase, stopping at the small landing mid-floor. There was a large portrait of Dr. Marcus, and the girl seemed surprised by it. As though she recognized him, the tattooed man joined her, and Birkin could see him reading aloud from the small plaque beneath the portrait. Dr. James Marcus, first general manager. Birkin shifted uncomfortably. He hated that picture. It reminded him of how he gotten his real start in an umbrella. Not something he'd like to think about.
Attention! This is Dr. Marcus.
Birkin jumped, looking around with wide eyes, his heart pounding. Wesker didn't flinch, but turned up the sound on the console's ancient intercom, as the voice of a man 10 years dead rang through the empty spaces and corridors of the entire complex.
Please be silent as we reflect on our company motto. Obedience breeds discipline. Discipline breeds unity. Unity brings power. Power is life.
The man and woman on the screen were looking around as well, but Birkin barely glanced at their direction. He grabbed Wesker's shoulder, unnerved. It was a recording, one he hadn't heard since he and Wesker had still been students at the facility. Where? Who? Wesker brushed his hand away, nodding toward the screen. Where the picture was fading, it seemed to blink, and then they were looking at a young man in another location. Birkin didn't recognize the room, but the young man staring back at them seemed almost familiar. He had long hair and dark eyes, was probably in his early 20s, and he had a sharp, cruel smile, as thin as cutting as a steel blade. Who are you? Wesker asked, surely not expecting to answer. There was no audio set up. The young man laughed, the sound pouring out of the intercom like dark silk. It wasn't possible. He didn't wear a headset, wasn't near any part of the comm system, but they could hear him clearly nonetheless. It was I who scattered the T-virus in the mansion, he said, his voice cold, his mouth sharpened. Needless to say, I contaminated the train, too. What? William Birkin blurted. Why? The young man's cold voice seemed to deepen. Revenge on Umbrella. He turned away from the camera, raising his arms to the shadows. Birkin and Wesker both leaned in, trying to see what he was doing. But they could only see the movement in the darkness, hear something like water. The young man turned back to look at them, his smile even sharper, and from out of the shadows behind them stepped a tall, distinguished man in a suit and tie, his white hair slicked back, his features lined with age but powerful, commanding. It was the same face that graced the portrait in the lobby. Dr. Marcus! Birkin gasped. 10 years ago, Dr. Marcus was murdered by Umbrella, the young man said, his voice almost a snarl. And you helped them, didn't you? He laughed again, that dark and silken laugh. A laugh that promised no mercy as Birkin and Wesker stared, stunned by the visible laughing presence of a man they'd watched die in a decade earlier. And that's it. We'll continue later. Bye.